It's 100,000 years ago, somewhere in the Middle East, maybe a cave overlooking what will one day be called Israel. The sun is setting, painting the limestone cliffs in shades of amber and rust, and there's a person kneeling beside a hole in the ground. Not just any hole. This one is deliberate, carefully shaped, about 3 feet deep. It took hours to dig with stone tools and bare hands, scraping through layers of sediment and rock. In their arms, they're holding a body. Maybe it's a child, maybe it's an elder. Someone who, just days ago, was breathing, talking, laughing. Now they're still. And this person, this ancient human whose face we'll never see, is gently, almost tenderly, lowering the body into the earth. They arrange the limbs just so, knees drawn up toward the chest, head resting on one side. Then they pause. For a moment they just sit there, looking down at the figure in the grave, and then they start covering it with soil, handful by handful, until the body disappears beneath the ground. This is the first funeral, or at least one of the first that we have clear evidence for. And here's what's absolutely wild about this scene. It makes no sense. From a pure survival standpoint, burying the dead is insane. Think about it. You're living 100,000 years ago. Every single day is a struggle to stay alive. You need to hunt, gather food, find water, avoid predators, protect your group from rival humans. Energy is everything. Calories are precious. Time is life. And yet, someone decided to spend hours, maybe an entire day, digging a hole in hard ground just to put a dead body in it. A body that can't help the tribe anymore, can't hunt, can't gather, can't reproduce, can't contribute, just dead weight, literally. The rational thing would be to leave it, walk away, let scavengers take care of it, focus on the living, but they didn't do that. Instead, they dug, they carried, they arranged, they covered, they created the first grave. Why? What possible reason could early humans have for wasting precious energy on the dead? And more importantly, what does that choice tell us about when we stopped being just another animal and became something else? Something that would eventually build civilizations, write poetry, and wonder about the stars? If you're using this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. Subscribe if you want and drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is right now. I love seeing Tokyo at dawn, Texas at midnight, all these different moments happening at once while we're all thinking about the same ancient mysteries. See, burial isn't just about disposing of bodies. Every animal dies, but almost no animals bury their dead. Elephants sometimes stay with their deceased for a while. Some primates show behaviors that look like mourning. But deliberate burial, creating a grave, covering it, sometimes even marking it, that's almost exclusively human. And the question of when it started is really the question of when we became us. Because burial requires something most animals don't have. It requires the ability to imagine. You have to imagine that this dead person matters even though they're gone. You have to imagine that how you treat them says something about who you are. You might even have to imagine that they're going somewhere else, to some kind of afterlife, and that how you send them off matters. All of that is abstract thinking, symbolic thinking, the kind of cognition that also gives you language, art, music, religion, everything that makes human culture possible. So when we find that first grave, we're not just finding bones in the ground, we're finding evidence of minds that work like ours, hearts that felt like ours, people who love their dead enough to dig. The oldest confirmed burials date back about 100,000 years, but the story is way more complicated than that. There are hints of earlier burial practices, controversial finds that might push the timeline back further. And then there are the Neanderthals, our evolutionary cousins, who were definitely burying their dead around the same time, maybe even earlier. Which raises another question. Did we come up with burial independently? Or is it something even more ancient, inherited from a common ancestor? Tonight, we're going to dig into all of it. The archaeological evidence, the theories about why burial started, the haunting details of ancient graves, the moment when humans began to care for the dead in ways that can still make us weep 100,000 years later. But first, we need to go back even further, before the graves, before the rituals. To understand why burial matters, we need to understand what came before it, how early hominins treated their dead when they were still just smart apes trying to survive. For most of Earth's history, death was simple. An animal died, and its body stayed where it fell. Scavengers came, bones scattered. Within weeks or months, the individual was gone, recycled back into the ecosystem. No ceremony, no ritual, no meaning beyond the practical transfer of nutrients from one organism to another. This is still how almost every species on the planet handles death. Even our closest relatives, chimpanzees and gorillas, treat dead bodies with what can only be described as pragmatic indifference. A chimp might show curiosity when a group member dies, might touch the body, inspect it, even carry it around for a few hours. But then they move on. They leave. The body becomes just another object in the landscape, subject to the same processes of decay as a fallen tree or a dead antelope. For millions of years, our ancestors did the same thing. When an early hominin died, the group might have lingered nearby for a short time. There might have been some confusion, maybe even distress, especially if the dead individual was a child or important group member. But eventually, always, the living moved on, because they had to. Resources didn't last forever in one place. Staying with the dead meant risking your own survival, and evolution doesn't reward sentimentality. So bodies were left behind, sometimes in caves where the group had been sheltering, sometimes in open camps that were simply abandoned, sometimes, if death came during travel, just wherever the individual happened to fall. The archaeological evidence for this is scattered but consistent. We find hominin fossils in places that show no sign of intentional placement, bones mixed with animal remains, stone tools and debris. The dead treated no differently than any other waste product of living. Take the cave sites of South Africa, places like Sterkfontein and Swartkrans. These limestone caves contain some of the oldest hominin fossils ever discovered, Australopithecines and early Homo species from over 2 million years ago. The bones accumulated naturally. Bodies fell down shafts, washed in during floods, or were dragged in by predators. There's no evidence of intentional disposal, no pattern to suggest anything other than random accumulation. These weren't burial sites. They were just places where bodies ended up preserved by geological accident rather than human intention. Even as hominins got smarter, developed better tools, learned to control fire, they still seem to treat death with that same practical indifference. Homo erectus sites spanning from Africa to Asia show the same pattern. Bodies left in living spaces, sometimes casually covered with debris, but showing no signs of the careful placement we'd associate with burial. They might have kicked some dirt over a corpse to reduce the smell, thrown some branches on top to keep scavengers away temporarily. But this isn't burial, this is body disposal, the most basic form of waste management. Anthropologists call this body processing, and it's important to distinguish it from intentional burial. Processing is purely practical. You have a dead body that's starting to smell and attract predators. Moving the entire camp is exhausting, so instead you do something quick to reduce the immediate problem. You might drag the body to the edge of the camp, cover it partially with stones or dirt, maybe push it into a natural depression or existing hole. The goal isn't respect or ritual. The goal is solving a sanitation problem with minimum effort. This is probably what most early hominins did for hundreds of thousands of years. and we'd expect little archaeological evidence because body processing doesn't create the kind of distinctive patterns that preserve in the fossil record. A body dragged to a gully and left isn't likely to fossilise. A corpse covered with loose dirt will probably be disturbed by scavengers before burial can properly occur. Only bodies that ended up in truly exceptional preservation conditions, places like deep caves or rapid sediment deposits, would survive for us to find. But then there's Cima de los Huesos. And this is where things get weird. Cima de los Huesos means pit of bones in Spanish, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Deep in the Atapuerca mountains of northern Spain, at the bottom of a 13-metre vertical shaft, archaeologists discovered the remains of at least 28 individual hominins. Not modern humans. These were earlier, something between Homo heidelbergensis and early Neanderthals, and they died around 430,000 years ago. Now, finding hominin bones in a cave isn't unusual, but finding this many individuals in such a specific location, that's strange. The shaft is narrow, dark, difficult to access. It's not a place where people would naturally live or where predators would drag prey. And yet somehow, over what might have been decades or centuries, the bodies of nearly 30 individuals ended up at the bottom of this pit. The question that's haunted archaeologists for decades is simple. How did they get there? Theory 1. It was a natural death trap. People accidentally fell down the shaft, got injured or killed, and their bodies accumulated over time. But the problem with this is probability. The shaft entrance was always obscure, not the kind of hazard you'd stumble into repeatedly. And finding 28 individuals who all happened to fall into the same 13-metre pit by accident strains credibility. If it was that dangerous, wouldn't the local population learn to avoid it? Theory 2. Predators did it. Cave bears or other large carnivores dragged bodies into the cave system, and they eventually ended up at the bottom of the shaft. But the bones show no evidence of carnivore damage, no gnaw marks, no characteristic patterns of predator accumulation. These bodies weren't scavenged before they ended up in the pit. They went in fresh, or mostly fresh. Theory 3, and this is where it gets really interesting, someone put them there, deliberately, intentionally. The living carrying the dead to this specific shaft and dropping them down, again and again, over years, maybe generations. If this theory is correct, and many archaeologists now think it is, then Cima de los Huesos represents something unprecedented in human evolution. Not quite burial, because the bodies weren't carefully placed or covered, but also not casual disposal, because it required significant effort to transport bodies to this specific location and push them down a narrow shaft. This is something in between, intentional, consistent disposal of the dead in a special place. Think about what this means behaviourally. Someone had to make decisions. This body needs to be moved. It needs to go to the pit, the special pit that we've been using for this purpose. Multiple individuals had to coordinate, because carrying a dead adult up and down mountain terrain isn't a one-person job, and this pattern had to be maintained across time, with new generations learning from old ones that this is what we do with our dead. Even more intriguing, the site contains a single beautiful hand axe made from red quartzite, found among all those bones. It's the only stone tool in the entire deposit, too perfect to have been dropped accidentally, too singular to represent normal cave activity. Some archaeologists think it was placed there intentionally. The first grave good, an offering to the dead, or perhaps a ritual object marking the pit as sacred space. But we have to be careful not to read too much into this. The people of Cima de los Huesos weren't us. They weren't even Neanderthals yet, though they were close. Their brain cases were smaller. Their tool technology was simpler. We don't know if they had language as we understand it, or symbolic thinking, or anything resembling religious beliefs. Maybe the pit was just practical, a convenient place to dispose of bodies that kept them away from living spaces, without requiring the exhausting work of digging graves. Maybe the hand axe fell in by accident, or was thrown in as part of some behaviour we can't begin to understand. Maybe we're seeing intentionality where there was only routine, but maybe not. Maybe 430,000 years ago, somewhere in the mountains of Spain, humans crossed a threshold. They began treating dead bodies not as waste to be discarded wherever convenient, but as something requiring specific, repeated, ritualized treatment. They weren't burying their dead yet, but they were doing something that required memory, tradition, coordination, something that suggests they understood death as meaningful in a way their ancestors never had. This is the murky transitional period, when death was no longer nothing, but not yet something. When bodies demanded special treatment, but the form of that treatment was still being invented. The archaeological evidence from this time is sparse, ambiguous, open to multiple interpretations. We're looking at behaviours that left only the faintest traces, trying to reconstruct motivations from people who couldn't tell us what they were thinking. But what we can say is this: by the time we get to 100,000 years ago, something had definitely changed. The ambiguity was gone. What we find in the archaeological record from that point forward isn't casual disposal or uncertain body processing. It's burial. Real, unmistakable, intentional burial of the dead. And that changes everything. So here's what we know for certain. Around 100,000 years ago, somewhere in the caves overlooking the Mediterranean coast, humans began doing something they had never done before. They started digging holes specifically for their dead. Not everywhere, not all at once. But in certain places, at certain times, scattered groups of anatomically modern humans made a decision that would echo through every generation that followed. They decided that bodies deserved something more than abandonment. They decided death required action, ritual, intention. The evidence comes from two limestone caves in what is now Israel, Kafze and Skul. These aren't impressive sights, not like the Great Pyramids or stone circles that would come later. They're just caves, worn by weather, filled with millennia of sediment. But inside them, archaeologists found something extraordinary. Bodies, deliberately placed, intentionally buried, protected. At Kafze Cave, about 10 kilometers south of Nazareth, excavators working in the 1930s and again in the 1960s uncovered remains of at least 15 individuals, men, women, children. What made these discoveries remarkable wasn't just the bones themselves. It was how they were positioned. One burial in particular tells us everything we need to know. A young adult, probably male, lying on his back with his legs slightly flexed, his arms carefully positioned. But here's the detail that changes everything. Clutched in his arms, pressed against his chest, was the skeleton of a child. Maybe 6 years old, maybe his son, maybe his brother, maybe just a child from his group. We'll never know the relationship, but we know this. Someone placed that child in his arms deliberately. Someone arranged them together before covering them with soil. Someone cared enough to ensure they would lie that way forever. That's not random. That's not a body falling where it died. That's intention. That's ritual. That's humanity wrestling with grief in the only way it knew how. The Skul cave, just 12 kilometers away on Mount Carmel, revealed even more. At least 10 burials, dated to roughly the same period, between 100,000 and 135,000 years ago. Again, the positioning tells the story. Bodies laid out on their backs or sides, legs drawn up in what's called a flexed position, not the contorted angles of death by violence or disease. One individual at Skul had something even more striking. The massive jawbone of a wild boar positioned deliberately near his body. Not there by accident, not dragged in by scavengers, placed, put there by other humans as the body was buried. This is what archaeologists call a grave good, an object included with the dead, possibly as an offering, possibly as equipment for some imagined journey, possibly just as a marker of identity or affection. We can't know the meaning, but we know it was meaningful. You don't waste a massive boar jaw, something that took effort and danger to acquire, unless it matters somehow. Now here's where this gets complicated. How do we know these are actually burials? How do we distinguish an intentional grave from just a body that happened to decompose in a cave? Good question. Because for decades, archaeologists have been arguing about exactly this. Some researchers see deliberate burial everywhere. Others are skeptical, demanding extraordinary evidence before accepting extraordinary claims. The criteria are pretty specific. First, body position. A corpse left where it died usually ends up contorted, twisted by the final muscular spasms or by scavengers and decomposition. An intentionally buried body is typically laid out in a consistent position. Back or side, legs flexed or extended, arms arranged in ways that rarely happen naturally. Second, grave construction. Are there signs of a pit being dug? Are there rocks arranged to protect the body? Is there evidence that soil was deliberately moved to cover the remains? At both Kafse and School, the answer is yes. The bodies were found in small pits carved into the cave floor, sometimes lined with stones, always covered with sediment that showed signs of deliberate deposition. Third, articulation. When a body is buried quickly after death, the bones remain connected, articulated in an anatomical position. When a body is left exposed, scavengers scatter the bones. Weathering breaks them down and they end up jumbled. The Kafse and School skeletons are largely articulated. They were protected from scavengers, which means they were covered soon after death. Fourth, grave goods. Objects that have no reason to be associated with a corpse unless someone put them there deliberately. The boar jaw at School qualifies. So do some stone tools found near other bodies, and fragments of red ochre, that iron oxide pigment that shows up in burial contexts around the world. Put it all together, and the case becomes overwhelming. These weren't accidental deaths. These were communities responding to death with ritual, creating the first cemeteries, establishing traditions that would persist for 100,000 years and counting. But recently the story got even stranger. In 2023, researchers announced they had found evidence of even older burials, not from modern humans but from a completely different species, Homo naledi, a small-brained hominin that lived in South Africa possibly 300,000 years ago. The claims were explosive. Bodies in cave systems, deliberately placed in hard-to-reach locations, some apparently buried in shallow graves, others positioned in ways suggesting ritual treatment. If true, this would push the origin of burial behaviour back 200,000 years and attribute it to a species with a brain a third the size of ours. The scientific community responded with immediate scepticism, and for good reason. The Homo naledi claims suffer from exactly the problems that the Kafse and School burials avoid. The bodies aren't in constructed graves, they're in natural cave features that could easily trap or accumulate bodies over time. The positioning isn't clearly intentional. It could just as easily be explained by how bodies fell into narrow passages. There are no grave goods, no clear evidence of deliberate modification of the burial environment. Most problematically, the dating is uncertain. The bones might be 300,000 years old, but that doesn't mean they were all deposited at the same time. Natural processes could have accumulated bodies in these cave systems over tens of thousands of years, creating an illusion of deliberate placement. The debate continues. Some researchers accept the Homo naledi burials as genuine. Others remain deeply skeptical, waiting for more evidence. The controversy highlights exactly why the Kafse and school sites are so important. They aren't ambiguous. The evidence isn't marginal. These are clear, unambiguous examples of deliberate burial behaviour by anatomically modern humans, roughly 100,000 years ago. And they tell us something profound. By this time, humans had developed minds capable of conceiving death as something meaningful. Not just the absence of life, not just a body that stops moving, but something that required response, that demanded ritual, that connected the living to something beyond immediate survival. Think about what this means. These people were still living in small groups, probably no more than 20 or 30 individuals. They were hunter-gatherers, moving seasonally to follow resources. Life was hard, mortality was high, and every day was a struggle against hunger, disease, predators, and environmental challenges. But when someone died, they stopped. They dug a grave. They positioned the body carefully. They included objects that mattered. They covered everything with soil and stones. Then they moved on, but they remembered. They must have remembered, because they kept doing it, generation after generation, creating a tradition that would spread across the world. The Kafse and school burials represent a threshold. Before this, we have no clear evidence of deliberate burial. After this, we see it everywhere humans go, into Europe with Neanderthals, across Asia with both modern humans and Denisovans, eventually to Australia, the Americas, every corner of the globe. Something fundamental changed in human consciousness around 100,000 years ago. We became the species that buries its dead, the species that treats death as significant, the species that creates rituals to manage grief and maintain connections across the boundary between life and whatever comes after. Those first graves in Israeli caves were just the beginning, but they were the beginning of something that makes us uniquely human. The recognition that death, while inevitable, deserves acknowledgement, that the dead, while gone, still matter to the living. Now let's talk about the people who might have taught us how to bury our dead. Or maybe we taught them. Or maybe, and this is the part that should make you pause and wonder, maybe we both figured it out independently because grief is just that fundamental to being human. The Neanderthals, our closest evolutionary cousins, the people who shared 99.7% of our DNA. The people who, as we discussed, came from the same bottleneck survivors as us, who split off maybe 800,000 years ago and went north while our ancestors stayed in Africa. And the people who are definitely, absolutely, without question burying their dead at least 50,000 years ago, probably earlier, maybe much earlier. The most famous Neanderthal burial comes from a place called Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq. In 1960, archaeologist Ralph Selecki uncovered the remains of 9 Neanderthals in this cave. But it was one individual, dubbed Shanidar IV, who captured the world's imagination and sparked decades of debate about Neanderthal emotional lives. When Selecki's team analysed the soil around Shanidar IV's skeleton, they found something extraordinary. Pollen. Not just random pollen that had blown into the cave over thousands of years, but concentrated clusters of pollen from specific flowering plants. Grape hyacinths, bachelor's buttons, hollyhocks, groundsel. Beautiful flowers. Flowers that bloom in different seasons, suggesting they were deliberately gathered and placed with the body. The Romantic interpretation wrote itself. A Neanderthal funeral. Mourners gathering wildflowers from the mountainside, laying them gently around their loved one's body, saying goodbye in a language we'll never understand. It was published in popular books, featured in documentaries, used as evidence that Neanderthals had souls, felt grief, contemplated death the same way we do. There was just one problem. Science doesn't care about romantic interpretations. Science cares about evidence. And over the following decades, researchers began poking holes in the flower burial story. Maybe the pollen was introduced by burrowing rodents who collect flowers for their nests. Maybe it was contamination from later human occupation of the cave. Maybe. The debate continues today. Some researchers remain convinced the flower burial was real. Others dismiss it as wishful thinking, our desire to see ourselves reflected in our extinct cousins. But here's the thing. Whether or not Shanidar IV was actually buried with flowers, there's no doubt he was buried. Intentionally. Carefully. His body was placed in a deliberate position, protected from scavengers, covered with sediment. This wasn't a person who died and happened to get covered by cave sediment over time. This was intentional deposition. And he wasn't alone. La Chapelle-aux-Saints, France, 1908. Workers discover a shallow pit containing the complete skeleton of a Neanderthal. Not just any Neanderthal, an old Neanderthal. Really old by Ice Age standards. This individual, later dubbed the Old Man of La Chapelle, was probably in his 40s when he died. For a Neanderthal living 50,000 years ago in Ice Age Europe, that was ancient. And his life had been hard. His skeleton shows evidence of severe arthritis, multiple healed fractures, dental abscesses that would have made eating agonizing. He was missing most of his teeth. His jaw had remodeled, the bone growing over the empty sockets. He would have needed his group to feed him soft foods, probably pre-chewed, for years before he died. And when he finally did die, they dug a pit for him. Not deep, maybe just a foot or so, but definitely intentional. They laid him out carefully, positioned on his side with his knees drawn up slightly. They placed animal bones around him, possibly joints of meat. Then they covered him with earth. This wasn't random. This wasn't just dumping a body somewhere convenient. This was effort, time, resources, all spent on someone who was already dead, who couldn't benefit from the labour, who couldn't reciprocate the care. Why do that? Why would Neanderthals living in harsh Ice Age conditions, where every calorie mattered and every hour of labour was precious, spend time and energy burying their dead? The sceptical answer goes like this. It was practical. Bodies attract scavengers, hyenas, wolves, bears, all eager for an easy meal. A rotting corpse near your living space is a health hazard, attracting predators and spreading disease. Burying the dead isn't spiritual, it's sanitary, like taking out the trash. This explanation has merit. It's parsimonious, as scientists like to say. It requires the fewest assumptions. Neanderthals were smart, practical people. Of course, they'd figure out that burial was the most efficient way to dispose of bodies that would otherwise cause problems. But then you look at the details, the body positions, the grave goods, the locations, and the practical explanation starts feeling insufficient. Take a Mud cave in Israel. A Neanderthal infant, maybe 10 months old, carefully buried with the upper jaw of a red deer placed on its pelvis. Why? If you're just disposing of a body to prevent scavenger problems, why add deer remains? Why position them so precisely? Or consider the Dedria cave in Syria. 2 Neanderthal children, one about 2 years old, the other just an infant. Both buried in deliberate positions. The 2-year-old had a flat limestone slab placed over its heart. Again, why? If burial is purely practical, why the additional ritualistic elements? The counter-argument is that we're seeing patterns that aren't there, that these supposed grave goods are just random objects that happen to be near the bodies, that we're projecting our own burial customs onto Neanderthals who are simply being hygienic. But Neanderthal burials keep showing up. La Ferracie in France has 7 Neanderthal burials, including several children. Kibara Cave in Israel has a nearly complete Neanderthal skeleton in a clear burial pit. Teshik-Tash in Uzbekistan has a child's burial surrounded by goat horns arranged in pairs. That's not random. That's patterned behaviour, repeated behaviour, cultural behaviour. And then there's the cognitive question. To bury your dead intentionally, you need certain mental capacities. You need to understand that the body in front of you, this collection of meat and bone that's no longer moving or responding, was once a person. You need to conceive of past and future, to remember who they were and understand they won't be anymore. You need, in other words, theory of mind. The ability to recognize that other individuals have their own thoughts, feelings and experiences separate from your own. And more than that, you need to recognize that those thoughts and feelings can end. That death is something meaningful, not just the absence of movement, but the cessation of being. That's sophisticated cognition. That's the kind of abstract thinking that requires significant neural development. And if Neanderthals had it, and all the evidence suggests they did, then they weren't that different from us cognitively. Their brains worked fundamentally like ours, which raises uncomfortable questions for anyone who wants to maintain a clear line between humans and everyone else. If Neanderthals understood death, grieved their dead, performed burial rituals, what does that say about human uniqueness? Maybe the answer is that there is no clear line, that the bottleneck survivors who became Neanderthals and the bottleneck survivors who became modern humans both carried the same basic cognitive toolkit, that both groups independently developed similar responses to death, because those responses emerged naturally from the kind of intelligence the bottleneck selected for. Or maybe, and this is speculation but intriguing speculation, maybe one group learned from the other. We know modern humans and Neanderthals interbred when our ancestors left Africa around 60,000 years ago. We know they lived in overlapping territories, competed for resources, probably traded goods and technologies. What if they also shared ideas? What if a Neanderthal band saw modern humans burying their dead with flowers and ochre, recognized the value in the ritual and adopted it themselves, or vice versa? What if the earliest burial traditions spread not through genes but through cultural transmission, ideas jumping from one human species to another? We'll probably never know for certain, but what we do know is that by 50,000 years ago, Neanderthals were definitely burying their dead in ways that suggest emotional and cognitive complexity. They were caring for their elderly, their disabled, their children. They were marking graves, possibly conducting ceremonies, definitely spending time and resources on activities that served no immediate survival function. That speaks to something profound. It suggests that Neanderthals had rich emotional lives, that they formed deep attachments to their group members, that they experienced grief when those bonds were severed by death, and that they developed cultural practices to help process that grief. In other words, they were human. Not in the strict taxonomic sense, they were Homo neanderthalensis while we're Homo sapiens, but in the deeper sense, in the sense that matters when we ask what makes us different from other animals. They thought abstractly. They created culture, they contemplated mortality, they mourned, and then, about 40,000 years ago, they vanished. The last Neanderthals died out, possibly absorbed into modern human populations through interbreeding, possibly outcompeted for resources, possibly just unlucky when climate conditions shifted again. But before they disappeared, they left us one final gift. Those burials, those careful arrangements of bodies and objects that tell us, across 50,000 years of time, that someone once stood where we're standing. Someone once looked at death and tried to make sense of it. Someone once felt grief so powerful they couldn't just walk away from the body. They had to do something, create some meaning, perform some ritual. They had to bury their dead. And in doing so, they showed us what we have in common. Not just genes, though we share those too, but something deeper. The need to mark death as significant, to treat the dead as deserving of care even when care can no longer benefit them, to create ceremony around the moment when life becomes absence. That impulse, that need, might be the most human thing about us, and the Neanderthals had it too. So here's the question that should keep you awake, except we're trying to help you sleep, so maybe just let it drift through your mind as you relax. Why did they do it? Why did those early humans and Neanderthals start digging holes and placing their dead inside them? It's not obvious. Burial is hard work. If you've ever dug a hole big enough for a human body using only stone tools and maybe wooden sticks, well, you haven't, because nobody does that anymore. But trust me, it would take hours, maybe days. You're talking about moving hundreds of pounds of earth and rock. Your hands would blister, your back would ache, and all the while you're doing this purely physical, exhausting labour for someone who can't benefit from it anymore. So why bother? For most of human prehistory we didn't. Our ancestors just left bodies where they fell, or maybe dragged them away from living areas. Natural processes took care of the rest. Scavengers, decomposition, the endless recycling of organic matter that keeps ecosystems functioning. It's efficient, requires no effort, and from a pure survival standpoint makes perfect sense. But then something changed. Around 100,000 years ago, maybe earlier, humans started doing something that made no practical sense whatsoever. They started burying their dead, and once they started, they never stopped. Every human culture we've ever discovered practices some form of intentional disposal of the dead. That's not a coincidence. That's evidence that burial serves some fundamental human need. But what need, exactly? Let's start with the practical theory, because early humans were nothing if not practical. Maybe burial wasn't about emotion or ritual at all. Maybe it was about hygiene and safety. Think about it from their perspective. You're living in a small camp, maybe 20 or 30 people, in a region with lions, hyenas, leopards, and every other carnivore evolution could dream up. Someone dies. If you just leave the body near your camp, what happens? The smell comes first. Human decomposition in warm climates is not subtle. Within days, the odour would be overwhelming, attracting every scavenger for miles around. Predators follow the smell, find your camp, and suddenly you've got leopards prowling around at night where your children sleep, hyenas digging through your living space, vultures circling overhead, advertising to every predator in the region that there's food here. From this perspective, burial makes perfect sense. Dig a hole, put the body in it, cover it with enough earth to contain the smell, and keep scavengers from easily accessing it. Problem solved. Camp stays safe. Predators stay away. Everyone survives another season. The archaeological evidence actually supports this theory to some extent. Many early graves are relatively shallow, just deep enough to cover the body and pile stones on top. Not elaborate ritual sites, but functional solutions to a practical problem. Some researchers have argued that burial might have started as nothing more than prehistoric waste management. But that doesn't explain everything. Because if it was purely practical, we'd expect to see bodies just dumped in holes, covered quickly, forgotten immediately. Instead, we see care. Bodies positioned deliberately, sometimes with their hands arranged in specific ways, stones carefully placed, time and effort invested far beyond what hygiene alone would require. This brings us to the emotional theory. Maybe they buried their dead because they couldn't bear not to. Think about what grief feels like. Someone you love dies, and every instinct in your body screams that this is wrong, that they should still be here, that you should do something. Now imagine that person is lying on the ground a few feet from where you sleep. Every day you see them, or what's left of them. Every day you're confronted with their absence made physical. For early humans, who likely lived in tight-knit family groups where everyone knew everyone else intimately, the emotional pain of losing someone must have been devastating. And unlike us, they couldn't just call a funeral home. They had to deal with death directly, physically, immediately. Burial might have been a way to cope with that unbearable reality, covering the body, hiding it from view, creating some physical separation between the living and the dead, not because they didn't care, but because they cared too much. Because seeing their loved one decompose day by day was more than they could psychologically handle. The care shown in many ancient graves supports this theory. Bodies aren't just thrown into holes, they're placed. Sometimes they're positioned as if sleeping, knees drawn up, hands near the face. Sometimes they're oriented in specific directions, toward the sunrise or particular landmarks. This is the behavior of people who are trying to make their dead comfortable, even though rationally they must have known the dead feel nothing. That's grief. That's love. That's the inability to fully accept that someone who was once alive and warm and speaking is now just organic matter returning to the earth. But humans are social creatures, and death isn't just an individual loss, it's a social crisis. This brings us to the social theory of burial. When someone dies in a small group, especially someone important, a skilled hunter, an elder with knowledge, a parent with children, their loss creates a hole in the social fabric. The group has to reorganize, redistribute roles, figure out how to survive without that person's contributions. Burial might have served as a social ritual that helped groups process this loss collectively. Everyone participates in digging the grave, everyone witnesses the burial, everyone shares in the physical and emotional labor. In doing so, they're reaffirming their bonds with each other, confirming that they're still a group, still connected, still capable of working together even in the face of death. This theory explains why many ancient graves show evidence of multiple people participating. The size of graves, the amount of earth moved, the stones placed on top, all of this suggests communal effort. Not one person digging alone in the night, but the whole group working together. It also explains why burial becomes more elaborate over time. As human groups grew larger and more complex, burial rituals became opportunities to demonstrate social cohesion, to show neighbouring groups that we take care of our own, to maintain traditions that connected living generations to their ancestors. But there's a darker possibility. The fear theory. Maybe they buried their dead because they were afraid of them. This might sound strange to modern ears, but consider how universal the fear of the dead is across human cultures. Ghosts, revenants, zombies, vampires. Every culture has stories about the dead who don't stay dead. This fear might be very ancient, possibly dating back to the first burials. Early humans probably didn't understand death the way we do. They couldn't know that the brain stops functioning, that consciousness simply ends. All they knew was that people who had been moving and thinking and talking suddenly weren't anymore. But their bodies were still there, still recognizable, still looking like they might suddenly open their eyes and sit up. In some early graves, archaeologists have found bodies weighted down with particularly heavy stones, or buried face down, or with their limbs bound. These aren't gestures of affection. These are precautions, ways to make sure that if the dead somehow did try to return, they'd have a hard time getting out. Maybe burial started partly as a way to contain the dead, to keep them in the ground where they belonged, to prevent them from walking back into camp and causing harm. It sounds superstitious, but remember, these were people who didn't have germ theory or medical science. They didn't know what caused disease, why people sometimes seemed healthy one day and dead the next. Maybe they thought death was contagious in some spiritual sense, that the dead could somehow spread their deadness to the living. There's another theory that's gained traction recently, the property theory. Maybe burial was about claiming land. Think about it from a territorial perspective. You're part of a small group trying to maintain control over a particular region, a valley with good water, a stretch of coastline with reliable shellfish beds, a forest with abundant game. Other groups want the same resources. How do you prove the land is yours? You bury your ancestors in it. You create permanent markers that say, "My people have been here for generations." The graves become proof of ancestral claims, physical evidence that this territory belongs to your lineage. When neighbouring groups challenge your right to be there, you can point to the graves and say, "My grandmother is buried here, and her mother before her." That's a powerful argument in societies where lineage and ancestry determine social standing. This theory explains why many later prehistoric cultures created increasingly elaborate burial sites. Not just simple graves, but cairns, barrows, megalithic tombs. Permanent monuments that could be seen from a distance, that would last for generations, that proclaimed in stone and earth, "This land is ours because our dead are here." But perhaps the most profound theory is the simplest, the consciousness theory. Maybe burial is evidence that early humans understood something fundamental about existence. They understood that they were going to die. This might be the most distinctly human realization possible. Most animals don't seem to grasp their own mortality. They fear immediate threats, they flee from danger, but they don't lie awake at night contemplating the inevitable end of their own existence. Humans do. We always have. Burial might be the archaeological signature of this awful, wonderful realization. The moment when some early human stood over a dead companion and thought, "This will happen to me too someday." And instead of just walking away from that terrifying knowledge, instead of repressing it or ignoring it, they decided to do something about it. They decided to treat death with ceremony, to mark the transition from life to non-life, to acknowledge that something profound had happened. In this sense, burial isn't primarily about hygiene or social cohesion or territorial claims. It's about confronting mortality, accepting it, and creating meaning around it. It's the moment when humans became capable of thinking about death abstractly, not just as something that happens to others, but as a universal fate that awaits everyone, including themselves. And once you understand your own mortality, everything changes. You start thinking about legacy, about what happens after you're gone, about whether your life had meaning. You start creating culture specifically designed to outlast individual lifetimes, traditions and stories and burial practices that connect the living to the dead and to the not yet born. The truth is, we'll never know for certain why the first humans started burying their dead. It probably wasn't just one reason, but all of these reasons working together. Practical concerns about hygiene, emotional needs around grief, social functions around group cohesion, supernatural fears about death and the dead, territorial claims about land ownership, and philosophical wrestling with mortality itself. But what we do know is that once burial started, it became universal. Every human culture, no matter how isolated or how different in other respects, developed some form of intentional treatment of the dead. That universality suggests burial serves some fundamental human need, something so essential that every group of humans independently decided it was worth the enormous effort required. We are the species that buries its dead, and in those ancient graves, dug with stone tools by people whose names are lost forever, we can see the first evidence of something profound. The first evidence that humans weren't just trying to survive anymore. They were trying to understand what survival meant, what death meant, what it meant to be human in a world where everyone you love will eventually disappear. But something else was happening in these ancient graves. Something that tells us our ancestors weren't just disposing of bodies or expressing grief. They were preparing their dead for something, a journey maybe, or another life. They were placing objects in graves, deliberately, carefully, meaningfully. The earliest grave goods are simple. A handful of seashells placed near a body at Kafsa Cave in Israel 100,000 years ago. The shells aren't local. Someone carried them from the Mediterranean coast 25 miles away. That's a full day's walk. These weren't random decorations. They were chosen, transported, and placed with intention. At School Cave, another early burial site, archaeologists found a wild boar mandible clutched in the arms of a skeleton. Not just buried nearby, but positioned deliberately, like the deceased was meant to hold it, to carry it somewhere. Think about what this means. Someone looked at a dead body and thought, they're going to need this. They're going to need these shells, this bone, these tools, not here, not in this world, but somewhere else, somewhere we can't see. That's not instinct. That's imagination. That's the ability to conceive of a reality that doesn't exist in the physical world around you. A reality that continues after breathing stops, after the heart goes silent. An afterlife. The grave goods from these early burials are sporadic, inconsistent. Some graves have them, most don't. Sometimes it's a single shell, sometimes a stone tool, occasionally animal bones or teeth. There's no standardized practice yet, no established ritual, but the concept is there, flickering like a candle flame in a dark room. The idea that death isn't an ending but a transition. By 50,000 years ago, grave goods become more common, more elaborate. Neanderthal graves in Europe start showing clusters of objects, stone tools arranged around bodies, animal bones placed in specific patterns, flowers, though the evidence for this is still debated, possibly laid on graves based on pollen analysis from some sites. But it's when we reach 30,000 years ago that something extraordinary happens, something that shows us just how far human imagination had evolved. The Sungir burial site in Russia, just outside Moscow, gives us a window into minds that were fully, completely modern in their capacity for symbolic thought. Picture this. It's the height of the last ice age. Europe is a frozen wasteland for much of the year. Survival requires everything you have, every ounce of energy, every resource your group can gather. Food is scarce. Making clothing warm enough to survive winter takes months of work. Every tool, every weapon, every useful object is precious because it might mean the difference between surviving and freezing to death. And then someone in your group dies, maybe several people, and your community makes a decision. They're going to bury these dead with more wealth, more crafted goods, more accumulated resources than most people will see in their entire lives. The Sungir graves contain the bodies of an adult man and 2 children, probably adolescents, buried in a single elaborate ceremony. The man's grave alone contained nearly 3,000 ivory beads, not found as raw ivory, but carved, shaped, polished beads that would have taken thousands of hours to create. Based on experimental archaeology, each bead would require about 45 minutes to manufacture. Do the math. That's over 2,000 hours of skilled labour, more than a year of full-time work by an expert craftsperson. The children's graves are even more spectacular. The 2 adolescents, buried head to head, were covered with more than 10,000 ivory beads between them. They wore ivory pins, bracelets and pendants. One child had a beautifully carved ivory spear, over 6 feet long, made from a straightened mammoth tusk. Another engineering marvel that would have required incredible skill and patience to create. They were wearing clothing entirely sewn with ivory beads. We know this because the beads were found in patterns that match garments, shirts, trousers, shoes, all decorated with ivory. When they were placed in the ground, they were dressed like royalty, like gods. But here's what makes this really profound. Analysis of the skeleton shows these children died around the same time, possibly in the same incident, and they weren't elite members of society and life. Their bones don't show signs of better nutrition than others in their community. They probably weren't chiefs' children or members of some ruling family. So why bury them with such extraordinary wealth? Why invest years of accumulated labour and irreplaceable resources in graves for two children who weren't special in life? Because your ancestors believed they would be special in death. They were preparing these children for a journey into another world, a world where they would need beautiful things, powerful tools, symbols of status and protection. They were sending them off equipped for whatever came next. This isn't just imagination anymore, this is theology. This is the birth of religion. Think about the cognitive complexity required for this behaviour. You have to believe in a realm that doesn't exist in observable reality. You have to believe the dead continue in some form, with needs and experiences. You have to believe that objects placed in graves somehow transfer to that other realm. You have to convince your entire community to sacrifice valuable resources based on this belief. And you have to create rituals, ceremonies, and practices that make this belief feel real and important enough to maintain across generations. That's abstract reasoning at the highest level. That's humans creating entire conceptual universes inside their minds, and then acting on those mental constructs in ways that shape the physical world. The grave goods at Sungir and hundreds of other sites from this period tell us something else too. They tell us humans had developed concepts of value beyond immediate survival. These beads weren't food. They weren't shelter. They didn't keep you warm or help you hunt. They were valuable because the community agreed they were valuable, because they represented time, skill, beauty, and meaning. That's the foundation of everything that makes human civilization possible. Money, art, status, law, all these things are based on shared belief in abstract concepts, and it all starts here, in graves, with objects placed beside bodies as offerings to realms that exist only in imagination. As time goes on, grave goods become more diverse, more elaborate, more culturally specific. By 20,000 years ago, you can tell what culture a grave belongs to just by looking at the offerings. Different groups develop different ideas about what the dead need. Some emphasize tools and weapons, others focus on ornaments and decorations. Some include food offerings, others don't. This diversification tells us that concepts of the afterlife were evolving, becoming more complex, more detailed. Different cultures were developing different mythologies, different stories about where the dead go and what happens to them there. Religion wasn't just being born, it was diversifying, evolving, adapting to different environments and social structures, and with these beliefs came power structures. If you're the person who knows the rituals for properly preparing the dead, if you're the one who can communicate with ancestors or guide souls to the afterlife, you have authority. You have a role that makes you essential to your community in ways that have nothing to do with hunting or gathering food. This is how shamans emerge, how priests develop, how religious specialists become part of human social organization. The dead create the sacred, and the sacred creates hierarchy. But underneath all the complexity, all the cultural variation, all the evolving beliefs and practices, there's something universal in these grave goods. There's hope. Every object placed in a grave is an act of hope that death isn't the end, that something continues, that the people we love aren't simply gone but have gone somewhere we might meet them again someday. Our ancestors were grappling with the same terror that haunts every human who has ever lived, the terror of mortality, of permanent loss, of the absolute finality of death. And they were doing what humans do best. They were imagining a solution. They were creating meaning where the universe offered none. Those shells at Kafse, carried 25 miles to be placed with a body, they're not just archaeological artifacts, they're evidence of love. Evidence that 100,000 years ago someone couldn't bear the thought that death was truly the end. So they gave their dead something beautiful, something to carry into whatever came next. We still do this today. We still place flowers on graves, still bury people with wedding rings and photographs and objects that mattered to them in life. We're still preparing our dead for journeys we can't see, to places we can only imagine. The grave goods are our first evidence that humans had become capable of transcending physical reality through belief, and that capacity, more than anything else, is what makes us human. Now here's where the story gets deeply strange, deeply human, because when archaeologists excavate these ancient graves, Neanderthal, early modern human doesn't matter, they find something unexpected. Something that appears again and again across thousands of miles and hundreds of thousands of years. Something that seems to transcend species boundaries and cultural differences. Red powder everywhere. Not just traces, not just residue. Deliberate heavy applications of red ochre, an iron oxide pigment ground from specific types of rock and stone, sprinkled over bodies, packed around skulls, mixed with fat to create pastes that were painted on bones and grave walls. Sometimes the ochre was applied so thickly that entire skeletons are still stained deep red today, 100,000 years later. At first, archaeologists thought this might be accidental. Maybe these early humans just happened to bury their dead in areas with naturally occurring red soil. But that explanation collapsed pretty quickly. The ochre in graves isn't random sediment. It's been processed, ground down to powder using specific tools. At some sites, researchers have found grinding stones still stained red from ochre preparation. At others, they've discovered lumps of raw ochre stored near burial sites like precious supplies, which, in fact, they were. Because here's the thing about ochre, it wasn't easy to obtain. Good quality ochre deposits were rare and highly prized. Archaeological evidence shows ancient humans travelled dozens, sometimes hundreds of miles to reach known ochre sources. They mined it, transported it back to their camps and stored it carefully. This wasn't some casual use of whatever material happened to be lying around. This was intentional, systematic, important. The oldest evidence of ochre use in burial context comes from School Cave in Israel, around 100,000 years ago. Early modern humans there were burying their dead with carefully prepared ochre powder scattered over the bodies, but they weren't alone. Neanderthal burials from roughly the same period show identical practices. Cave sites in France, Spain, Iraq all show Neanderthal graves with ochre staining. Even more remarkably, when modern humans began spreading out of Africa around 60,000 years ago, they carried the ochre tradition with them. Everywhere they went, Australia, Europe, Asia, the Americas, they brought red pigment to their graves. Some of the earliest evidence of human presence in Australia, dating to 50,000 years ago, includes ochre-stained burial sites. When the first humans crossed into the Americas around 15,000 years ago, they were still painting their dead red. This is one of the most widespread, persistent cultural practices in human history. More universal than any language, any religion, any social structure. For over 100,000 years across every inhabited continent, humans associated red pigment with death and burial. Why? The most obvious answer is blood. Red ochre looks like dried blood. It has the same deep crimson colour, the same powdery texture when dried. For people who lived intimately with death, who hunted, who saw injuries and birth and violence regularly, blood was the essence of life. When blood flowed out, life flowed out with it. Blood was the visible manifestation of the life force itself, so maybe ochre was a substitute for blood. a way of giving the dead back what they had lost. Some anthropologists think ancient humans might have believed the red pigment could reanimate the deceased, restore their life force, prepare them for some kind of continued existence. The ochre wasn't just decoration, it was medicine for the dead. But there's another interpretation that's equally compelling. Red ochre might have represented transformation rather than restoration. Think about what red means in nature beyond blood. It's the colour of fire, of sunset, of iron-rich earth. It's associated with change, with one state becoming another. Fire transforms wood into ash and warmth. Sunset transforms day into night. Red earth is the boundary between surface and underground, between the world of the living and whatever lies beneath. Maybe when ancient humans covered their dead in ochre, they were marking them as transformed. No longer living, but not simply dead either. Changed into something else. Something that existed in a different state, a different realm. The red pigment was boundary marker. A visible sign that this person had crossed from one existence to another. There's actually some fascinating archaeological evidence supporting this interpretation. At several ancient burial sites, researchers have found that ochre was applied in specific patterns, not randomly distributed but carefully placed on certain parts of the body. Skull often received extra attention, hands and feet too. Sometimes the pigment was concentrated around the chest, over where the heart would have been. This suggests ritual knowledge, systematic beliefs about which body parts were most important in death. The skull made sense. It housed consciousness, memory, identity. The hands and feet were the parts that had touched and moved through the world. The heart was the drum that had measured out a lifetime of moments. By marking these parts with ochre, ancient humans might have been identifying what they believed needed special treatment or protection in death. We also find ochre used in ways that have nothing to do with bodies. In some graves, the walls and floors are painted red. In others, objects buried with the deceased are coated in pigment. Tools, ornaments, even food offerings show traces of ochre application. This suggests the red pigment was creating a kind of environment, transforming the entire grave space into something different from the ordinary world. Some researchers think this represents early evidence of belief in an afterlife. If you're painting the walls of a grave, you might believe the deceased will inhabit that space somehow, that they'll need a proper environment prepared for them. If you're coating grave goods in ochre, you might believe those objects will be used again, that they need to be transformed along with their owner to function in whatever realm comes next. But here's what's really remarkable. The ochre tradition wasn't just about death. Archaeological sites show ancient humans using red pigment for all kinds of purposes. They painted themselves with it, probably for ceremonies or to mark social status. They decorated tools and objects. They created what might be the world's first abstract art, geometric patterns and simple drawings made with ochre on cave walls and rock surfaces. The oldest known drawing, created by human hands, was made with ochre on a small stone in South Africa around 73,000 years ago. Just a simple crosshatch pattern, but unmistakably intentional, unmistakably symbolic. Someone ground up red rock, mixed it into a paste, and made marks that meant something. Marks that weren't just copying reality, but representing ideas. This tells us something profound about what ochre meant to ancient humans. It wasn't just about blood or death or transformation. It was about making the invisible visible, about taking something internal, some thought or belief or feeling, and giving it external material form. Ochre was the bridge between the world of thoughts and the world of things. When they sprinkled it on their dead, they were doing the same thing, taking their internal beliefs about death, whatever those beliefs were, and making them visible, tangible, real. The red pigment was proof that death meant something, that the person who had died mattered enough to receive this treatment, that the community cared enough to spend time and resources on this ritual, and maybe that's the real answer to why ochre appears so universally in ancient graves. Not because all ancient humans shared identical beliefs about the afterlife or the soul or transformation, but because they all shared the same need to mark death as significant, to make their grief and loss and confusion visible, to do something when someone died that acknowledged the magnitude of what had happened. Red ochre was humanity's first universal symbol, the first thing that meant something similar across cultures and time periods and geographic boundaries. It said, "This matters. This person mattered. Death changes things, and we mark that change with colour." We still do this, in a way. We still associate red with powerful transitions, with passion and danger and life itself. When we see red, something in our ancient brain remembers blood and ochre and graves dug by hands that were almost but not quite like ours. Every human alive today carries genes from people who ground red rocks into powder and sprinkled it on the bodies of their dead, who believed, in whatever way they were capable of believing, that colour could bridge the gap between life and death, between the visible and invisible, between what we can touch and what we can only imagine. The ochre is still there in those ancient graves, still red after 100,000 years, still marking the place where someone decided that death deserves ceremony, that the dead deserved care, that the boundary between existence and non-existence needed to be painted in the colour of life itself. Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. You're not in a city or a village. There are no houses, no streets, no cemeteries with carved stones, just open land, a river somewhere in the distance, cold air, low fires, a small cluster of people who have almost nothing, and in the middle of them, a tiny body. For most of human history, the death that came most often wasn't of elders, or hunters, or warriors. It was children, infants lost in their first winters, toddlers taken by infections you and I would treat with a pill, young kids who never got to grow into the tools they clumsily imitated holding. For every adult skeleton archaeologists uncover, there were once many, many more small bodies that never left a trace. But sometimes, very rarely, conditions were perfect. The soil was right. The cave was dry. The grave stayed undisturbed. And in those graves, we find something that cuts through 100,000 years like it's nothing. We find proof that people love their children, not in some vague, abstract way, in ways you can touch, in objects you can count, in choices you can still see in the position of tiny bones and carefully placed offerings. Let's travel, slowly, to one of the most haunting places in the archaeological record, a place called Sungir. It's about 30,000 years ago, in what is now Western Russia. The world is cold. Neanderthals still exist somewhere to the west. Modern humans are spreading. Small bands are hunting mammoths and reindeer across the tundra. On a low river terrace, your people have chosen a place that feels safe. They build shelters, napstone tools, sew furs. They survive another winter, and then 2 children die. We don't know how. Disease, accident, a cold snap their bodies couldn't handle. What we do know is what happened next. The adults did not leave the children on the surface. They did not abandon them to scavengers. They dug. They created a grave, carefully, deliberately. They placed the 2 children side by side, head to head, their bodies arranged in a long, shallow pit. One was about 10 or 11 years old. The other was slightly younger, maybe 9. Old enough to have friends. Old enough to have favourite games. Old enough for everyone to know their voices. And then the real work began. Archaeologists counted what was buried with them. More than 10,000 beads made from mammoth ivory. Each bead shaped, polished, drilled, probably taking an hour or more of labour, strings of beads sewn onto clothing, wrapping the bodies in shimmering ivory garments that would have glowed in torchlight. Alongside the beads there were ivory bracelets, carefully carved pendants, spears made from straightened mammoth tusk, too large for the children to have actually used, but symbolically powerful. One of the boys had a headdress, a halo of perforated fox teeth framing his skull. All of this, all of it, going into the ground. This wasn't just we buried them. This was we poured thousands of hours of human time and skill, our finest art, our rarest materials, onto the bodies of two children who would never grow up. Sungir is astonishing for another reason. The adult man buried at the same site, also rich in beads and ivory, still doesn't reach the extravagance of the children's grave. Statistically, in terms of the cost to the group, those two kids were buried with more care and more material wealth than almost anyone else. Why? One answer is status. Maybe they were the children of an important leader. Maybe the grave was a political message. Maybe the beads and spears said, "This lineage matters." But there's another answer, one that feels simpler and also deeper. They were loved. Their deaths were a rupture, not a footnote. Grief needed shape. Emotion needed something to cling to. So the community did what humans have done, over and over again. They turned sorrow into ritual. If you were there, standing close enough to see the tiny hands, you wouldn't be calculating bead counts or resource costs. You'd be watching parents whose faces looked like parents' faces do now when they have to say goodbye to a child. The lavishness of the grave isn't just economics, it's emotion rendered in ivory. And Sungir isn't alone. Across the Ice Age world, children's graves stand out. In Italy, at a site called Ostuni, archaeologists found the skeleton of a young woman buried with an unborn child still inside her, around 28,000 years old. She was laid on her side as if still sleeping. Red ochre sprinkled carefully, shell beads, pendants, and bracelets arranged with her, framing the belly that never got to deliver. Who was the grave for? The mother? The baby? Both? You can almost imagine the midwives, the older women, realizing there was nothing they could do, then later choosing to hold those two lives together, even in death, in the position of the bones and the objects placed around them. In the Czech Republic, at sites like Dolní Věstonice, archaeologists uncovered the triple burial of 3 young individuals, adolescents and late children, arranged with care, limbs interlaced, dusted with red ochre, accompanied by carved figurines and animal bones. Their positions aren't random. One lies on their side, one on their back, one in a strange twisted posture that suggests they were intentionally posed. This isn't disposal. This is choreography. In Africa, in a cave in Kenya called Pangayasaidi, a grave was found that might be the oldest deliberate burial of a child by modern humans on the continent, about 78,000 years old. Just a small pit dug in the cave floor lined with something soft. In it, the body of a 3-year-old child curled up like they were sleeping. The skull had slumped forward after the flesh decayed, but microscopic analysis showed it had originally been supported, maybe by a pillow of leaves or skins. The torso had been wrapped carefully. The grave was shallow, but it wasn't careless. Someone had taken the time to hold the child's body gently as it was lowered, and to make sure the head rested in a natural, comfortable position. 78,000 years ago, someone tucked a dead child in for the last time. Think about the worlds those graves represent. Different continents, different climates, different technologies, different languages. If they could hear each other speak, they wouldn't understand a single word. And yet, in every case when a child died, the reaction looks eerily, painfully familiar. Careful positioning, special treatment, objects that would have mattered to the living placed with the dead. There's something else archaeologists have noticed. If you line up graves from many prehistoric sites, adults, elders, adolescents and children, and you ask a simple question, who gets the most elaborate burials? It's not always the powerful old hunter, it's often the youngest. Not because they led complex lives, they didn't have time. The girl at Sunghyr never became a toolmaker. The 3-year-old in Kenya never hunted. The buried infants never spoke their first full sentences, yet they receive grave goods that are disproportionate to their achievements. Hundreds or thousands of beads, pendants that took days to carve, pigments that had to be mined and processed and carried from far away, carefully made miniature tools that their hands never used. In some Neanderthal sites, like La Ferracie in France or Roc de Marsal, children are buried in especially well-shaped pits, with stones arranged around their bodies like protective shells. Sometimes their graves are separated slightly from the main area, as if the group wanted a special place for them. It's hard to avoid a conclusion that doesn't feel scientific or objective, but human. Children's deaths hurt more, so people responded with more ritual, more colour, more time, more objects that could have fed someone, clothed someone, protected someone, but instead were surrendered to the earth alongside a small, silent body. This tells us something crucial about prehistoric minds. Love and grief came before theology. You don't need a formal religion, or a priesthood, or a written myth to motivate this kind of behaviour. You just need attachment. The deep, almost biological ache of a parent who has watched a baby take its first breath, its first step, heard its first laugh, and then watched that same small body go still. Grave goods in adult burials can often be explained as status markers, or political theatre, or displays of wealth. But when we see the same or greater investment poured into a tiny skeleton that never got to wield power, the explanation shifts. These burials are about relationship, not reputation, and the pattern keeps repeating. In Mesolithic Europe, as hunter-gatherers fished rivers and gathered along coastlines, child burials show similar care. Tiny stone tools placed with infants, as if equipping them for a life they never lived. Shell beads circling baby skulls like crowns. In early farming villages, when people started settling down and building permanent houses, we find children buried under floors, beneath doorways, close to hearths, not sent away to the edge of the settlement, but kept at the heart of the home. Maybe the family wanted them near. Maybe they thought the child's spirit would protect the house. Maybe they just couldn't bear the thought of that small body lying out somewhere far from where they had slept. Whatever the exact beliefs, the emotional logic is the same: keep the child close. Anthropologists sometimes talk about mortuary variability, the wide range of ways cultures handle death. Exposure on platforms, cremation, secondary burial, scattered bones. But running through this diversity is a thread that's almost impossible to break. When it's children, the rules bend. Modern hunter-gatherers often hold special rituals for infants and small children. Shorter mourning periods in some cultures, longer in others, but always different. In many societies, parents create small shrines or carry tokens, locks of hair, bits of cloth, tiny objects, to maintain a connection with the lost child. The archaeological record suggests this isn't new behaviour. Take all of that and roll it back tens of thousands of years. Strip away the houses, the villages, the pottery, the writing. You still have babies, you still have parents, you still have unpredictable environments where disease or a moment of bad luck can mean catastrophe. And when catastrophe came, something in those parents responded in a way you would recognize instantly. They cradled the body, they wept, they wrapped the child, they placed them on something soft, they dug the earth, they lowered the body gently, not carelessly. They added objects that carried meaning: beads, ochre, teeth, tools, animal bones. They covered the grave. They remembered the spot. Maybe they came back. In Sungir, you can imagine the parents returning to that low hill year after year, glancing toward the place where 10,000 beads and 2 small skeletons slept. In Kenya, you can picture a mother or father touching the spot on the cave floor where the 3-year-old lay, even after the living child was long gone. We can't hear what they said, we can't watch the rituals, but in the layout of bones and objects we can still feel the weight of what they felt. And this is where children's graves become more than just sad stories. They are diagnostic tools. They tell us when humans started feeling about each other the way we do now. You can imagine a purely practical mind calculating only survival. Children die often, don't get too attached, don't waste resources. If natural selection had favoured only that cold rationality, you wouldn't expect elaborate child burials, you'd expect the opposite. Instead, we see the early appearance of something costlier and much less rational in the short term. Strong attachment, deep bonds, grief that disrupts life, time and energy being spent on bodies that no longer contribute to survival. And yet, in the long run, this kind of emotional wiring may have been exactly what our species needed. Parents who are willing to pour enormous effort into their offspring, who can't just move on when a child dies, are also parents who are likely to invest heavily in the care, teaching and protection of the children who do survive. Groups that ritualize grief, that close ranks around bereaved families, that show every member they are valued even when they're weak, create stronger social glue. In small, vulnerable bands facing harsh climates and scarce resources, that glue could be the difference between extinction and endurance. So when we look at a child's grave from 50,000 years ago, with beads and ochre and tiny bones curled as if sleeping, we're not just looking at a tragedy. We're looking at one of the engines of humanity, the ability to care so much that you reshape the world around the dead, the capacity to hold the lost in memory, to create symbols, colours, objects, patterns of burial that keep their presence alive in some abstract way. 100,000 years blur together when we look back. Climate cycles, glacial advances and retreats, species appearing and disappearing. Most individuals vanish without a trace. But a handful of children didn't. They're still here, in shallow pits and caves and river terraces and ancient campsites. Their graves are messages in a bottle from people who never imagined anyone would see them again. The message isn't written in words, it's written in the line of a spine carefully arranged, in the abandoned wealth of 10,000 ivory beads, in the way a small head was supported so it would not droop. It says, "We loved this child. We couldn't save them. We tried to do right by them anyway. Everything else, religion, art, philosophy, the stories we tell about souls and afterlives and gods, may have grown from that root, from the unbearable feeling that someone small and beloved has left, and the equally unbearable need to act, to do something, anything, to mark that passage." When you listen to this and feel a tightness in your chest, that's not just empathy in the present. It's resonance with a pattern that goes back tens of thousands of nights like this one. Fires burning low, parents awake in the dark, children breathing softly nearby, or not breathing at all, and in that darkness someone deciding to pick up a bead, to paint with ochre, to dig, to turn raw grief into ritual. Children's graves are windows into ancient hearts. Look through them, and you see that across 100,000 years of cold and hunger and fear, one thing has stayed the same. Parents loved their children. They mourned them. They buried them with care. And in doing so, they were already quietly shaping the human story. By the time your ancestors were walking out of Africa, people had already been lowering bodies into shallow pits for tens of thousands of years. A quiet gesture, a body curled on its side, maybe a stone tool, maybe a bit of red ochre on the bones. Nothing like pyramids, nothing like cathedrals. But those little pits were seeds. Over tens of thousands of nights, those seeds grew into something vast. Cemeteries, tombs, megaliths, entire landscapes reshaped in conversation with the dead. To see how that happened, imagine time speeding up. Watch the last 100,000 years play out like a slow-motion time-lapse. Graves flickering on and off across the map, growing, clustering, turning into monuments. At the beginning it's simple, a single grave here, another one 200 miles away, lone burials tucked just outside a campsite or at the mouth of a cave. Each one an event, not a pattern. Somebody died. The group gathered. They dug, placed, covered, walked away. Then, gradually, something starts to change. You see more than one grave in the same place. At first, just 2 or 3, separated by decades or centuries. But by around 20,000, 15,000 years ago in some regions, the pattern is unmistakable. Humans are returning to the same spots to bury their dead again and again. They're inventing the idea of a place of the dead. Archaeologists call these early clusters cemeteries, but they're more than that. They're memory anchors, physical coordinates where stories, identities and bloodlines can be attached to the ground. Picture a riverside terrace in what is now Russia, or a low-rise above a floodplain in the Levant. At first, it's just a good camping spot. Then someone dies. They are buried under the edge of the shelter. A few years pass. Another death. Without quite planning it, your ancestors start stacking the generations into the soil. Over time, the living begin to orient themselves around those remains. Camps are pitched near the graves. Children are told, "Your grandmother sleeps there." Elders remember where particular bodies were laid, even after the surface traces are gone. That's when something important happens. The group doesn't just belong to the land anymore. The land now belongs in part to the group. Because their dead are in it. This is the quiet birth of territory as something more than hunting range. The dead become anchors that hold people in place. You don't just move on when the herds move. You feel a tug, a reluctance to abandon the bones of your ancestors. That tug will eventually build villages, then cities. At the same time, burial itself is changing. In the very oldest graves, bodies are often simply placed and covered. But as time passes, you see more careful positioning. The dead are laid on their sides, curled like sleepers, or placed on their backs, arms crossed, hands folded. Grave goods become more common. Teeth ornaments, carefully shaped blades, shell necklaces that might have taken weeks of labour to make. These aren't just practical tools for an imagined journey. They're also a way of saying this person mattered. Their identity continues in some way that can be acknowledged, maybe even negotiated with. As the Ice Age ends and climates stabilise, the pace of change accelerates. Glaciers retreat. Forests and grasslands move into the empty spaces they leave behind. Animals shift their ranges, and humans do something they've never done on a large scale before. They stay put. The development of farming around 12,000 years ago in places like the Fertile Crescent is often described as a revolution in food production, but it's equally a revolution in death. Once people settle, graves don't drift across the landscape with them. Cemeteries thicken. Generations pile up in the same ground. The dead begin to outnumber the living in any given village. Imagine a tiny early farming settlement, maybe 50 or 100 people, surrounded by fields of barley and wheat. Under the houses, or just outside the village boundaries, dozens of bodies are buried. Children, elders, adults taken by disease or accident. Every time a house is rebuilt, someone uncovers an old grave, a skull, a femur, a bead still strung around a neck. The bones of the dead are no longer relics of a distant camp long forgotten. They are constantly rediscovered, handled, reburied. Death becomes a visible, recurring presence in daily life. In some early farming communities, places like Çatalhöyük in what is now Turkey, people begin to do something striking. They don't just bury the dead and leave them, they revisit them. Skulls are dug up, cleaned, sometimes painted with red ochre or plastered to give them faces again. Eye sockets are filled with shells. These skulls are then displayed in houses, built into walls or reburied in clusters. The dead are moving from the outskirts of camp into the heart of the home. This is the beginning of explicit ancestor worship. Once you start keeping the skulls of your dead relatives in your house, you're not just remembering them, you're living with them in a literal sense, eating, sleeping, arguing, making love under the gaze of people who came before. Anthropologists think this might have served multiple functions. On one level, it's emotional, a way of staying close to beloved parents, children, partners. On another, it's political. If you can point to a line of ancestors whose skulls are stacked in your house, you can claim a deeper right to the land or a higher status in the community. My grandfather built this house. My great-grandmother broke this ground. The dead become not just memories but documents, proof of ownership, tools of negotiation. They're woven directly into the social fabric. As burial becomes more common, something else appears on the landscape. Spaces that are not quite homes, not quite graves, but something in between. Ritual centres. The most famous early example is a place called Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey. It appears around 11,600 years ago, before pottery, before metal, before the full flowering of agriculture in that region. On a lonely hill, people began raising enormous stone pillars, some weighing 10 or 20 tons, carved into T-shaped forms. Many of these pillars carry reliefs of animals, snakes, foxes, boars, vultures, arranged in strange, deliberate scenes. Göbekli Tepe is often called the world's first temple. It probably wasn't a burial ground in the usual sense. There are not rows of graves there like in later cemeteries, but human bones do show up, sometimes in unusual contexts. Skull fragments with cut marks that suggest ritual handling. Bones deposited in special places. Whether or not Göbekli Tepe held formal burials, it is clearly part of the same evolutionary curve. The human impulse to mark death, to gather around particular stones and spaces, to build for something other than immediate survival. You can think of Göbekli Tepe and sites like it as experiments in monumental memory. Instead of just digging a pit and walking away, people are reshaping entire hillsides into symbolic landscapes. The pillars may represent powerful beings, ancestors, spirits, or mythic figures. The gatherings there might have included feasts, dances, initiation rites, and yes, mortuary rituals as well. As centuries pass, this trend spreads and mutates. By 6,000 or 5,000 years ago, in Europe, North Africa, and parts of Asia, another figure appears on the time-lapse, the megalithic tomb. Long barrows, dolmens, passage graves, huge stone slabs arranged into chambers, then covered by earth to form mounds. Narrow corridors you can walk down, sometimes aligned with the rising sun on a particular day of the year. These structures are built to last, but they are also built to be visited. Unlike a simple grave, which is dug, filled, and sealed, a megalithic tomb often has a reusable chamber. Bodies are placed inside over generations. Bones are moved, rearranged, sometimes displaced to make room for newcomers. In some cases, only selected bones, skulls, long bones, are kept, while others are removed. Death has become architecture. Imagine walking at dawn along a misty ridge dotted with burial mounds. Each one is a doorway into your community's history. Inside, ancestors sleep in piles of bone. Outside, stones mark alignments with sunrises, solstices, or certain stars. Human groups are now tying their dead not just to the land, but to the sky. The cycles of seasons, the turning of the year. Burial becomes a calendar, a cosmology, a model of the universe made out of rocks and silence. As societies grow more complex, villages clustering into towns, then into early city-states, death rituals continue to elaborate. In ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and China, we see the same basic elements that began with a shallow grave 100,000 years ago, now magnified into civilization-scale projects. Single graves become necropolises, cities of the dead, stretching for miles. Grave goods become full inventories of a life. Tools, jewellery, food, animals, servants, even entire boats. Ancestor worship, once expressed in plastered skulls on a house wall, now emerges as fully articulated religion. Lineages of kings traced back to gods, temples where priests perform rituals to sustain the dead in another world. In Egypt, the idea of the grave as a portal into the afterlife leads to pyramids, rock-cut tombs in the Valley of the Kings, and intricate mummification rites. The body must be preserved, the name must be written, the right spells must be spoken. But beneath all the ornate theology, the same ancient logic is still there. The dead matter. How you treat them matters. Your own fate and the fate of your community depends on keeping the right relationship with those who've gone before. In China, by the time of the Shang dynasty, rulers are buried in deep pits with chariots, weapons, bronze vessels, and human and animal sacrifices. These aren't just displays of power. They reflect a cosmology where the dead rulers become powerful ancestors, mediators between the living and the spirits. Offerings are made to them. Oracles are consulted. The line between remembering the dead and worshipping them dissolves. Everywhere you look, the same pattern unfolds in different forms. The small pit grave becomes a family plot. The family plot becomes a village cemetery. The cemetery becomes a monumental necropolis. The beloved grandmother whose skull you kept in your house becomes an ancestor spirit who watches over the fields, then a clan deity, then, eventually, part of a pantheon. Even in societies without writing, megalithic monuments and complex mortuary rituals serve similar functions. They create shared stories. They fix lineages. They justify hierarchies. If your people can point to a tomb that has stood for 500 years and say, "Our ancestors built this, we belong here," that's a powerful political tool. Death rituals become ways of managing power. Who gets the bigger grave? Who is buried near whom? Who is included in the ancestral line? And who is excluded, forgotten, or buried on the margins? The answers to those questions shape inheritance, leadership, and social order. At the same time, the emotional core remains deeply human. Funerals, whether in a Paleolithic cave or a Bronze Age city, are chances to gather, to grieve together, to tell stories about the person who is gone. The shape of the grave changes. The theology around it changes. The gods' names change. The quiet moment of lowering a body into the ground does not. And as rituals grow more elaborate, something else happens. They begin to carry people across cultures and generations. A child watching a burial in a Neolithic village is learning not just how to mourn, but how to be part of that society. The songs, the gestures, the order of the procession, these are lessons in identity. Centuries later, when those same people develop writing, they begin to record these practices in myths, laws, and scriptures. The link between graves and religion becomes explicit. Many later religious traditions carry faint echoes of those earliest burials. The idea of an underworld beneath our feet. The notion of a judgment after death, in which the dead must be supplied or guided. The belief that ancestors can bless or curse the living depending on how they are honoured. Even our modern cemeteries, with their rows of carved stones and carefully tended plots, are descendants of those first clusters of graves on a river terrace or a hillside. We still mark our dead with durable materials, stone, metal, meant to outlast individual lifetimes. We still return to those places on specific dates. We still tell stories there, whispering to the air as if the people beneath the ground can hear. If you step back and look at the whole arc, from a Neanderthal child laid carefully in a shallow pit, to Göbekli Tepe's circles of carved pillars, to the great tombs and cathedrals and memorials of historical times, you can see one long, continuous experiment. Humans trying to answer the same questions in increasingly elaborate ways. What do we owe the dead? What do they mean to the living? And what does it say about us that we cannot simply let a body lie where it falls and walk away? Over 100,000 years, the answers crystallize into architecture, art and ritual. Graves become monuments. Monuments become stories written in stone, a language of memory that stretches beyond any single life. And every time we build another one, from a small headstone to a colossal mausoleum, we are participating in that same ancient project, trying, in our own way, to make peace with the fact that one day we too will be on the other side of the soil. What does all of this actually tell us? About us? Not about Neanderthals or Denisovans or early Homo sapiens as distant, almost mythical figures in a textbook, but about the strange, fragile, stubborn creature you are, lying there in bed, heart beating, mind wandering through a story about people who died 100,000 years ago. Burial is one of the first clear signs that something fundamental had changed inside the human mind. Before burial, death was just an event. A body stopped moving, animals scattered, the smell changed, scavengers came, life went on. After burial, death became a question. What happened to them? Where did they go? Are they still somewhere? To dig a hole, to gently place a body inside, to arrange limbs, to add objects, to sprinkle ochre, to cover it up carefully. That isn't just cleaning up a mess. That's thinking about death as something more than a biological process. That's treating a corpse as if it still matters. Burial is the moment when humans stopped seeing bodies as things and started seeing them as stories. You can feel that shift in every grave, from Neanderthal skeletons laid on their sides as if sleeping, to tiny infants bundled in red ochre, to adults buried with tools they would never again hold. Each burial is a sentence in a new language the species was inventing, a language of meaning. It tells us that consciousness wasn't just about better tools or cleverer hunting tactics. It was about time. To bury someone, you have to think in 3 directions at once. You remember the past, who this person was, how they laughed, how they walked, the way they threw a spear or braided a cord or hummed to themselves while working a piece of flint. You feel the present, the raw weight of loss, the silence where their voice used to be, the stunned, heavy stillness of the group gathered around the body, and you imagine the future. What will happen to them under the earth? What will happen to you one day? What stories your grandchildren might tell about this person you're placing in the ground? Burial is time travel in the human mind, long before we ever invented clocks. And once you can think about time like that, culture becomes possible. Because as soon as you're aware that things end, you start caring about what lasts. You start preserving memories in objects and places. You start treating ideas as something that can outlive you. You start building rituals, habits, stories, anything that can be repeated, handed down, carried forward. The first graves are like anchors thrown into the river of time. They say, "Here, remember this. don't let this person be swallowed up by the flow. And once you start anchoring the dead, it's only a small step to anchoring knowledge, customs, values. Death awareness and culture grow together, like two vines twisting around the same trellis. Imagine a small group sitting by a fresh grave 100,000 years ago. A child is buried there, wrapped in ochre-stained skins, maybe with a tiny shell or a bead by their side. The adults are quiet. The air is cold. Somewhere a fire crackles. One of them starts to speak. Maybe they tell a story about where children go when they die. Maybe they say the child is with the ancestors or with an animal spirit or in the stars. Maybe they don't know what they believe yet. Maybe they're inventing it as they say it. Another person adds to the story. Then another. Maybe someone hums a melody they'll use again the next time someone dies. Without planning it, they're building something that will outlast them. A shared way of facing the one fact no one can escape. This is where culture begins to crystallize, not in feasts or triumphs or great inventions, but in the quiet, painful moments when a group has to decide what to do with a body that used to be a person. Confronting mortality may have been the single greatest engine of human creativity. It pushed our ancestors to ask questions no other animal seems to have asked. If life ends, what is it for? If people die, how do we keep them with us? If everything can be taken away, what really matters? There are only so many ways to answer those questions, but uncountable ways to express them. Some groups answered with stories of an underworld. Others imagined a sky world, or a land beneath the water, or a world of spirits layered over this one like an invisible second skin. Some answered with art, carving animals and human figures into bone and stone, painting walls deep inside caves, as if trying to speak to something beyond living eyes. Some answered with monuments, circles of stone, lines of mounds, fields of standing markers that turn the landscape itself into a memory palace of the dead. But all of them, in their own ways, were doing the same thing, using imagination to push back against the finality of death. Burial is one of the earliest receipts we have for that impulse, a fossilized moment of resistance, a trace of a mind that looked at a corpse and refused to believe that this was the whole story. And underneath the symbols and beliefs, underneath the ochre and the beads and the careful arrangements, there is something even simpler. Love. Bones don't get buried because they're useful. Corpses don't get tucked into sleep-like positions because it's efficient. Infants don't get decorated with rare pigments because it makes survival easier. They get buried because someone cared. Because someone couldn't bear to leave them to the scavengers. Because someone wanted them to rest in a particular place. Because someone needed to feel that they had done right by the dead. Every grave is proof that, at least once, love outweighed practicality. Even the most pragmatic explanations for burial, hygiene, predator control, keeping camp safer, can't fully explain the tenderness you see in some of these burials. Hands folded, heads cradled on stones, objects placed exactly where a living person's hand could reach them. Those details speak a language we still understand without translation, and it's not just love for the one who died. Burial is also about love for the ones who remain. When you create a ritual around death, you're not just taking care of a body, you're taking care of the living hearts left behind. You're giving them something to do with their grief, a script to follow when they don't know what to say, a gathering point for the community. Ancient burial sites are not only cemeteries, they are therapy sessions, support groups, communal pauses in the rush of survival, where everyone takes a breath and acknowledges, silently or aloud, we're in this together. We lose together. We remember together. That's why so many graves show signs of revisiting, layers of ochre added over time, new objects placed in old pits, fireplaces built nearby, as if people kept coming back to sit with their dead. Burial creates a shared geography of memory, a map of places where grief has turned into story. And if you trace that map forward, from those first graves to everything we do now around death, you see a single unbroken thread. When we stand in a modern cemetery, reading names carved into stone, we're doing something very old. We're marking a place as special, as charged with memory, just as our ancestors did when they chose a particular cave hollow or hill crest or river bend for their dead. When we place flowers on a grave, we echo the ancient impulse to leave objects with the departed. The shells, the tools, the beads, the ochre, little gifts meant for someone who can no longer open their hands. When we speak at funerals, we're continuing the practice of turning a life into a story at the moment it ends, saying out loud, "They were here. This is what they meant. This is how we will carry them." Even when we change the details, coffins instead of pits, cremation instead of burial, photographs instead of cave paintings, the underlying structure is the same. We gather, we remember, we imagine, we let go, but not completely. The first people to lay a body gently in the ground and cover it up could not have imagined hearses, cathedrals, crematoriums, urns on mantles, online memorial pages. They didn't know what a religion was, or a philosophy, or a therapy practice. But they set the pattern. They discovered that how we handle the dead shapes how we live among the living. Because once a community starts honouring its dead, it has to decide who counts as one of us, whose body gets special treatment, whose name or story is remembered. Burial quietly draws lines around identity and belonging. These early graves are the shadows of early communities. A child buried with care tells you that children mattered, even when they could no longer grow up to help the group survive. An elderly person buried with tools they can no longer use tells you that status and respect could outlive physical usefulness. A person buried in the heart of a camp tells you they were central in life, not isolated on the margins. From these ancient decisions, the idea of community deepens. We is no longer just the ones who are alive right now. It becomes the ones who came before, the ones who are here, and the ones who will come after. Burial expands the tribe across time, and that, more than anything, may be what it means to be human, to see yourself as a link in a chain that began long before you and will continue long after. When archaeologists uncover a 100,000-year-old grave and carefully brush soil away from a skull or a tiny hand bone, they aren't just revealing a dead person. They're exposing a moment when the living stood on that same spot and asked the same silent questions you ask, lying in the dark, thinking about the people you've lost. Are they gone? Are they at peace? Where did they go? And, just as importantly, what do I do now? Burial is one of the oldest answers our species ever gave. You place the body with care. You surround it with symbols of love and memory. You set it in a special place. You mark that place in your mind and sometimes on the landscape. You return to it, in person or in thought, when you need to remember who you are. Even if your own culture doesn't bury its dead in the ground, the pattern is still there, transformed but recognizable. Cremation urns in columbaria, names etched into glass walls, ashes scattered in places that mattered, photographs on altars, candles lit on specific days of the year. Each of these is a distant echo of that first moment when someone looked at a lifeless body and decided it deserved more than abandonment. So when you hear about Neanderthals placing their dead in graves, or early Homo sapiens sprinkling red ochre over the bodies of children, it isn't just an interesting detail of prehistory. It is your story. Because the same brain that wondered about those first burials is inside your skull now. The same emotional circuits that made them weep, or sing, or sit in stunned silence by a grave are the ones that ache in your chest when you think about someone you've lost. The distance between you, lying in the dark, and them huddled by a grave under a Paleolithic sky is much smaller than it seems. You both live with the knowledge that everything you love will end. You both stubbornly refuse to let that be the end of the story. You both create meaning and ceremony and memory and hope in the face of that fact. Burial is the fossilized footprint of that refusal. It tells us that being human is not just about thinking or speaking or making tools. It's about caring so much that even death can't erase a person from your world. It's about weaving the dead into the fabric of the living through ritual, story, and place. It's about looking at the darkness at the edge of life and deciding together to light a small shared fire. The graves of our ancestors are the first of those fires. Our funerals, our memorials, our quiet moments of remembrance are the ones still burning now. So now, as the last torchlight in the cave flickers low, you can picture the full arc of this story. The long, hard road from bodies left where they fell to careful graves cut into the earth. From scavengers and silence to flowers, red ochre, and tiny beads placed gently beside a sleeping child. When you pull the camera back far enough, something becomes very clear. Burial isn't just about the dead. It's about the living trying to make peace with what they can't escape. Every grave we talked about tonight, from the first simple pits of 100,000 years ago, to Neanderthal bodies curled on their sides, to children wrapped in ochre and ornaments, is really a conversation. The living bending over the dead and whispering, "You mattered. You belong to us. You're not just gone. You're part of our story." When we visit a modern cemetery, we're walking across the surface of that same conversation. Marble stones instead of stone tools, flowers from a supermarket instead of wild blossoms from a hillside, prayers in whispered words instead of ochre spread by hand. Different languages, same impulse, to make death bearable by weaving it into meaning, if you're lying in bed right now, letting this history drift through you as you fall asleep. Notice how far back that feeling goes. The ache in your chest when you imagine a child's grave 80,000 years ago. The strange warmth when you picture Neanderthals lighting a fire near a body, maybe telling stories about hunts they shared. That isn't just empathy, it's recognition. Somewhere inside you, in the parts of your brain that still remember how to be a small primate in a big dangerous world, you know what they were doing. You know what it is to lose. You know what it is to love someone who isn't breathing anymore and desperately want that not to be the end. The people who first buried their dead are gone, but the emotions that guided their hands are still alive in you. You're the continuation of that ritual, and there's a kind of comfort in that. Because if burial is older than civilization, older than writing, older than cities and kings and cathedrals, then our fear of death and our attempts to soften it are not personal failures. They're part of being human. When you stand at a grave today, or scatter ashes, or keep a photograph on your wall, you're standing in a very old tradition. You're doing what your Neanderthal cousins did, what early Homo sapiens did in caves lined with ochre, what parents in Ice Age valleys did when they wrapped their children carefully and laid them in the earth. You are never grieving alone. Somewhere in your genetic past, unbroken through tens of thousands of generations, are people who also stayed awake at night and wondered what happens after the last breath. People who looked at a body and thought, this can't be all there is. People who created the first grave goods, the first offerings, the first symbols for an invisible world beyond this one. Knowing that doesn't solve the mystery of death, but it can make the dark feel less empty. When your mind wanders to your own mortality, and it will because your brain is wired to rehearse endings, you can remember that burial is not just about loss. It's also about continuity, about being folded back into the same earth your ancestors slept in. about joining a chain so long you can't see either end. They lay down in the soil, under stone and sky. You lie down now in your bed, under roof and blanket. Different materials, same gesture. The body resting, the mind loosening its grip. In a way, every night is a little rehearsal for that final sleep. And just as our ancestors learned to dress that final sleep with meaning, ochre, beads, flowers, tools, you can choose to dress your nightly sleep with gentleness, with curiosity instead of dread, with the quiet knowledge that you're part of a story that has been going on since the first grave was dug. If this journey through deep time has kept you company tonight, if walking among Neanderthal burials and ancient children's graves helped your own thoughts settle a little, feel free to gently tap like before you drift off. It helps more than you might think, and it tells the YouTube algorithm that slow, thoughtful stories are worth sharing. If you'd like more nights like this, more long walks through forgotten ages while you fall asleep, you can subscribe to the channel and turn on the little bell. That way, the next time we wander back into the past, your phone will remember to bring you along. And when you have a quiet moment, tomorrow morning, or the next time you can't sleep, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Are you in a city apartment with traffic humming outside? A countryside house with wind in the trees? A dorm room? A hospital? A night shift break room? Drop a comment and tell me your corner of the world. One of the strange joys of this channel is seeing these tiny dots of light appear on the map. People in different countries, different time zones, all lying down under different skies, listening to the same ancient stories. It's like rebuilding those old networks of kinship and trade, but now the exchange goods are ideas and images, drifting quietly through fiber optic cables instead of footpaths. And if you feel especially connected to this kind of slow, carefully researched storytelling, and you want to support it a little more directly, there is an optional channel membership. Totally up to you. Think of it as leaving a small offering at the edge of the campfire so the stories can keep going. But whether you join or not, you're very welcome here. Just being here, listening, is already part of the ritual. For now, you can let the last details of this episode fade. The shape of the first graves, the red shimmer of ochre, the careful hands placing tools beside a still body. Imagine the ground beneath you, not just the floor, but the layers of earth under that, layer upon layer of time, fossils, forgotten campsites, lost footpaths, ancient graves. Imagine all those people resting there, not in horror or fear, but in the same quiet you're moving toward now. They survived their days, they met their nights, they lay down and did not rise again, and somehow, through all of that, you arrived here, alive, breathing, listening. So as you close your eyes, you can think of sleep as joining them for a while, not in death, but in stillness, in trust, in letting go. You're lying down in a very long tradition. May your breathing slow, may your thoughts soften, may you rest tonight as peacefully as a body laid carefully in the earth by loving hands, under a sky full of stars your ancestors also saw. Good night, sleep well, and we'll wander through time together again soon.